Conspiracy theories are very stupid when taken seriously, but I've always found them at least interesting because they are almost like world building in a way. Because you have to take a fantasy setting, like 5G towers somehow create a virus or that the world is flat, and try to use your imagination to make that setting as self consistent as possible. In fact, I often think that conspiracy theories would be amazing settings for fantasy or even sci-fi stories if people weren't taking them seriously. So that's what we are going to do today. We're going to take the flat earth setting and try to do world building to transform it into a setting for a good fantasy story. Now, when we think of a flat world, we often think of a disk somewhere in space. And usually there's, I don't know, a turtle, or in this case, a cosmic dog that is carrying the world around. This is the kind of setting that Terry Pratchett used in Discworld, and it's pretty good. But once I saw this video by a guy that believes in conspiracy theories that had a very interesting alternative. What if, instead of the world being a disk floating in space, the world is instead an infinite plane going in all directions forever? Basically, a plane like this, which is dividing the universe itself into two sides. I think that idea is kind of interesting. So let's consider. Now we have this flat world, and then we have stars both above and below it, because above and below are relative, so there would be on both sides. And we could even have gravity, and even more, we could have a gravity similar to that of Earth. It might sound weird that an infinite plane with infinite mass would create a finite gravitational field, but actually this is a very common problem in physics classes. And what you find is that the gravity above the plate is actually finite, because gravity gets weaker and weaker with the distance. So even though there's an infinite amount of matter far away, it has an infinitely small contribution to the gravitational field. And so the point is that it's finite. So that's nice. Also, we could consider this plane to have a similar structure to that of Earth, so that the people living here would have similar resources. Like there is clay on top and there is iron at the bottom, so they can have mines and they can find gold, and they can find all the resources they need for their civilization. But the problem is, of course, the day and night cycle. How would that work? Well, I see no reason why there couldn't be stars above the infinite plane. And come to think about it, there could be even other planets and solar system floating above the infinite plane. That's actually really interesting. But let's consider that there is a star above the infinite plane, and it is shining a light on it. Well, there is a problem, because no matter where you are in the plane, you are going to be able to see the star. And since the star is shining light all over the plane, yeah, it's going to illuminate some places more than others, but it's going to illuminate all of it. Instead of having stars shining light all over the place, as they usually do, we would need them to be shooting very localized beams of light, like a laser. And incredibly enough, there is something like that in nature. There's a kind of neutron stars which are spinning. They are called quasars. Quasars produce beams of incredibly energetic particles that are very localized, kind of like a galactic scale laser. The problem is that the beams of quasars have way too much energy. But the truth is that any kind of world building aside from the real world at some point requires vagueness or hand waving. So in this case, we are just gonna say that somehow there exists a star capable of shining very localized beams of light that for some reason have much less energy than usual, and that energy is about that of the sun we have. Now, we can imagine that there are many such stars at different distances from the plane, illuminating some regions of it and allowing life to develop. But the problem is that everything else on the plane, everything that is green in this scenario, would be very cold because it's a perpetual night there. And in such cold light, the air actually freezes. And so all of this land would be covered not just in water ice, but in oxygen and nitrogen ice. And in fact, the only liquid would be liquid helium, which is actually a very weird fluid that has some interesting properties, but we'll talk more about that later. So now we have this oasis of life. But the problem is that in this oasis, there is not a night and day cycle because the star is always shining. So we need to create a day and night cycle somehow. Well, turns out that quasars, when they are spinning, they do something like this. They spin, and as they spin, their axis of rotation moves around. And as the axis of rotation moves around, their beam of light moves too. Me from the future, I actually found this video which illustrates this effect much better. Here you can see a pulsar star orbiting around a regular star, because the universe is cool like that. Anyway, back to the video. This means that we could have this beam of light moving in a circle about a region of the plane. This region of the plane would receive light in a periodic fashion, creating a day and night cycle. Now, this means that there are no sunrises and no sunsets. You only see the land far away becoming brighter and brighter until you are finally like in the afternoon, and then it becomes darker and darker, and you see some land far away becoming brighter and brighter. But what about the moon? Well, I see no reason why there couldn't be some kind of celestial body orbiting this star. And even more, if the rotation speed of this celestial body approximately matches the rotation with which the star spins above its axis, then it is conceivable that it would always be on the opposite side of the beam of light, and so the people here would always see it at night. Nice. Now let's talk about weather. In real life, we have the light of the sun shining on the equator, and this creates two important things. It evaporates some water in the oceans, and it heats up the air. Hot air expands, and as it expands, it moves around the humidity that is evaporating from the oceans. This creates the jungles near the equator, and then it creates some dry regions in both sides of the jungle, creating the deserts, and it creates some more humid regions around the poles, creating the forests of Europe and the forests of New Zealand and South Africa and South America. Now, how would that happen in this oasis of life? Well, remember that there is a lot more ice around the disk than inside it, and so the hot air, as it expands, it's more likely that it will move to the rim than move to the center, and so most of the humidity would move to the rim, creating jungles and eventually forests in this direction. And yes, there might be some humidity going this way because this region would be cold as well, but a lot less humidity. And so maybe the center of the oasis would have a lot of deserts and the rim would be full of forests and jungles. But now let's think of how the people living in this world would perceive it. The first thing is that, yeah, there would be stars, but they would have a much different experience of them as we do. Because for them, the stars would not move in the sky. The only stars that move are the ones that are close enough to the plane, and there are a few of them, sure, but most of them are so far away that they don't seem to move at all, and so they wouldn't relate the movement of the stars to the seasons. Also, another interesting thing is how would the people of this world perceive the moon? Because in our world, the moon is tidally locked. This means that no matter where you are on Earth, you always see the same side of the moon. This is the explanation why there are so many cultures around the world that have stories about the moon rabbit. Because you look at the moon, you see the dark spots in there, and you're like, that looks like a rabbit. But in this world, it would be different. You see, the people living near the rim would see some parts of the moon, but then the people living near the center would see another part of the moon, and they would not see the same side. In fact, to see the other side, you would have to move around the disk. This means that different cultures living in different places of the disk could see the features of this celestial body that spins around their star and develop different stories about the shapes that they see in their moon. Also, if there's only a sun and a moon in this scenario, there would be no moon phases. But there could be moon phases if there was a third object spinning around the stars, which I have trouble showing because I only have 3 hands. But imagine that this is some kind of very large asteroid. It could, I don't know, put itself between the star and the moon and then cause shadows, and I don't know, it would create a sort of phases system that people could use to tell seasons and tell time and stuff like that. And I don't know, there could be a whole solar system spinning around the star above the plane. And just imagine the mythologies they could create if they had that solar system above them. That would be really interesting and really cool. But I know what you're thinking. There are 2 CDs here, so I am representing 2 Oases of Life. So is there life in all of them? Good question. That's exactly what the people in the disk would be thinking about. I think it's likely that the people living in the disk would realize the nature of the world fairly early on. After all, many civilizations on Earth thousands of years ago realized that the world was round. So they could realize that the world is flat, and maybe they could look at the distance past the valleys of snow and maybe have some kind of a glimpse on some other shining places. Maybe they could see some other low stars. Maybe they could see some stars moving around a little in the sky. And yeah, they could reason that they are some other stars, like the one above them, that are illuminating other places in the disk. But eventually they would realize that there are these other places, and they would start thinking if there's anyone in those places, if there's life out there. Now, crossing this valley of frozen air between the oases, it's really difficult. It would be much easier to simply send radio waves and see if anyone replies. And who knows, maybe they do, and they start communicating with other forms of life that have developed in other oases in the plane. They could even start communicating with life forms that are on oases on the other side of the plane, because remember, there are stars in the other side as well. But let's say that no one replies. Let's say that they don't know if they are alone in the universe. Well, eventually they could develop airplanes, but airplanes don't work in the place between the oases because remember that air is frozen and airplanes need air to fly. But they could develop rockets, and they could shoot rockets to the other oases, and maybe those rockets could have cameras and send signals back of what they see, kind of like what we do when sending probes to other planets. The problem is that they cannot use rockets for send people in the same way, because remember that these rockets are basically missiles. They are never breaking from the gravity of the plane, and so sending people and all the things that people need to survive is very difficult. But maybe they could develop some kind of machine able to travel in the space between the oases. This is how it could work. The most important thing for this machine would be to keep the inside isolated from the outside, so that the people inside would not freeze to death. And that's fairly possible. The biggest problem is how do you get fuel to travel such long distances? Well, lucky for you, you are surrounded by oxygen. And liquid oxygen is the fuel that we use in rockets. So this machine would have to be digging all the time, somehow filtering the frozen oxygen from the frozen nitrogen and the other frozen gases, and then using that frozen oxygen as a fuel. Also, they could unfrozen that oxygen for the crew inside to breathe. So that's nice. Even more, they could use the liquid helium as a superconductor to run all the equipment of this machine, which is also really good and very energy efficient. And so it is conceivable that people could travel this long distance in this frozen wasteland until they reach a point near the rim of the other oasis. As they reach hotter and hotter places near the second oasis, oxygen is no longer frozen. I think it would be better to establish a main camp in here, where you have all the energy you're gonna need, and then send teams with snowmobiles or something to travel the rest of the distance, and they would reach the rim. They would be basically on the Arctic, and they would eventually reach either a tundra forest or maybe the ocean, and then they would start exploring this new world. As the crew explores, they start taking samples. They already know there is life in this oasis. They saw it in the cameras they sent with rockets. But what they didn't know is that the air is breathable and the water is drinkable. In fact, this oasis is very similar to their own, which is very lucky. They decide to explore the forest. The cameras could only show them the surface of this forest, but not what is below the leaves. And as they do, maybe they find ruins. They find houses, they find buildings, they find vehicles that they can tell are meant to be holding people. Maybe they even find the ruins of rockets. Huge rockets, meant to hold not just cameras, but people and animals, a full-on colony ship. And there are many of them, abandoned. As they see this, they cannot escape the nagging feeling that the people living here were acting in desperation, in a race against time to save life. They are scared. They don't know what to think. They run back to the camp. They take the snowmobiles. They travel back to the main camp. But what they find is that the machine that brought them here is destroyed. And all the crew is dead, slaughtered by something. They could see the tracks in the snow, and they can see that whatever did this is following the tracks of their machine back to their oasis. They can no longer go back. Their only option is to stay in this oasis, try to survive, rebuild civilization, and start the cycle all over again. Thanks a lot for watching. I do a ton of very different videos in this channel, so if you like some more world building, I'm gonna leave you one right over here, and if not, then the YouTube algorithm thinks that you are gonna enjoy this video the most.